Good morning. It's July 5th, 2026, and there's a lot to get through, so let's get right into it. The biggest story right now sits at the center of the fragile ceasefire between the United States, Israel, and Iran, and it comes down to a single word: inspections. On the surface, this sounds like a technical bureaucratic dispute. In practice, it is the fault line that could decide whether the current pause in fighting turns into something lasting, or whether it collapses back into open conflict. Here is where things stand. Iran's parliament speaker and chief negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, went on Iranian state television and said flatly that international inspectors do not have the right to examine any nuclear site that was bombed during the 12-day war with Israel and the United States last year. According to Ghalibaf, inspectors currently have access to exactly 2 locations inside Iran: the Bushehr nuclear power plant and the Tehran research reactor. He specifically rejected any reporting suggesting inspectors would be allowed into Natanz, Fordow, or Isfahan, the 3 sites that were struck hardest during the war, calling those reports false. That statement matters because it directly contradicts what U.S. officials and the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency have both said publicly. Just days earlier, IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi told reporters there was, in his words, an agreement in place, and that for Iran to comply with it, his inspectors would need access to nuclear sites throughout the country. He stopped short of saying explicitly whether that access would extend to the bombed and destroyed facilities, which is exactly the ambiguity Iran and the United States are now fighting over in public. President Trump, for his part, posted on his social media platform that Iran had, in his words, fully and completely agreed to the highest level of nuclear inspections long into the future, dismissing Iranian denials as false statements amplified by what he called the fake news. Vice President J.D. Vance had earlier said Iran agreed to let international inspectors back into the country as part of what he called a major milestone toward permanently ending Iran's nuclear weapons program. So you have 3 very different public stories: the American administration saying Iran agreed to sweeping, open-ended inspections, the IAEA saying an agreement exists but declining to specify its scope, and Iran's own negotiators insisting on Iranian state television that no such broad agreement was ever made. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman, Ismail Bagheh, went further, telling reporters in Tehran that Iran has not even met with Grossi and has no specific timetable for any inspection of its nuclear facilities. When a PBS reporter put that discrepancy to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, his response was short. He said Iran is wrong, that they know they're wrong. It's worth stepping back and asking why this dispute exists at all, because the answer tells you a lot about what each side is actually trying to protect. For the United States and Israel, the entire point of the war back in the summer of 2025, and the strikes that followed, was to set back Iran's ability to build a nuclear weapon. Operation Midnight Hammer, the American bombing campaign that hit Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan with bunker-buster munitions, was framed by Washington as having accomplished that goal. But strikes alone don't prove anything to the rest of the world. The only way to actually verify that enriched uranium stockpiles are gone, damaged beyond recovery, or still sitting somewhere in tunnels and bunkers, is to send inspectors in with equipment that can measure radiation, take samples, and count material. Without that, any American or Israeli claim of success is just an assertion. That's why access to the bombed sites specifically, not just the 2 facilities still functioning normally, is the crux of the matter for Washington. For Iran, the calculation looks different, and it's worth representing it fairly. Iranian officials have argued for months that international inspections were used, in earlier rounds of diplomacy going back to the original 2015 nuclear deal, as a tool that primarily benefited the countries pushing for restrictions, while Iran continued to face sanctions and economic pressure regardless of its compliance. Following the war, Iran suspended cooperation with the IAEA altogether through a law passed by its parliament, and only agreed, months later in September of 2025, to a narrower framework allowing some inspections to resume. Under that narrower framework, inspectors have visited a handful of sites, including Bushehr, but were still denied access to the facilities that were bombed. From Tehran's perspective, opening up bombed military and nuclear sites to foreign inspectors, while the war is barely a year in the rearview mirror, and while Iran still doesn't have a permanent settlement locking in sanctions, relief, or a return of its frozen assets, is giving away its remaining leverage for free. There's also a genuine security argument on Iran's side. Allowing detailed foreign access to sites that were recently attacked could, in the view of Iranian military planners, provide targeting information useful for a future strike, not just information about the current state of the nuclear program. There's also a $100 billion plus financial thread running underneath all of this. Iran has been negotiating for the release of a large sum of frozen assets, with figures as high as $12 billion discussed around the Islamabad talks, and much larger sums cited elsewhere in the broader negotiation. Ghalibaf claimed at one point that a deal had been reached to release $12 billion in frozen Iranian funds. Vance's response was notably narrower. He said only that if Iranian assets were unfrozen, that money would need to go toward Iran purchasing American agricultural products, which is a very different arrangement than a straightforward release of funds. The U.S. Treasury did confirm it was waiving sanctions on Iranian oil sales through the 21st of August, which gives Iran a real economic lifeline while talks continue. So money is moving, sanctions are being eased in some areas, but the core disagreement over inspections remains unresolved. And that unresolved core is what makes outside observers nervous about how durable this ceasefire really is. Domestically, Iran's leadership is negotiating from a position that is genuinely difficult. A government survey from late June found that roughly 60% of Iranians say they can no longer make ends meet financially, and around 70% say they want changes in how the country is governed. That kind of economic and political pressure at home gives Iran's negotiators an incentive to bring back something they can present as sanctions relief or an economic win, while also giving hardliners inside the system a reason to resist anything that looks like capitulation on sovereignty or nuclear sites, since appearing weak domestically carries its own political risk for the leadership. Now, layered on top of the inspections dispute is a separate but related argument over the Strait of Hormuz. This is the narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula that a huge share of the world's oil shipments passes through every day, and it has been a flashpoint on and off throughout this conflict. During the fighting, Iran's military threatened tankers moving through the strait, and at various points launched drones and missiles at shipping and at regional targets, including Kuwait and Bahrain. Ghalibaf has said publicly that the administration of the strait will never return to how it operated before the war, a statement that reads as an assertion of greater Iranian control going forward. Secretary Rubio's response to that was direct. He said, no country is allowed to charge tolls or fees on an international waterway, rejecting any Iranian claim to a special taxing or regulatory authority over Hormuz. Iran's deputy foreign minister has made similar comments asserting that the strait falls under Iranian jurisdiction rather than the authority of U.S. Central Command, which has historically patrolled those waters as part of maintaining freedom of navigation. As of the most recent reporting, tanker traffic through the strait has continued, and Trump stated in early July that he had agreed to keep the strait open with no further naval blockade, citing what he described as major concessions from Iran, though, as with the inspections dispute, the two sides don't fully agree on what exactly was conceded. On the military side, Central Command has been fairly active in publicizing its air defense record throughout this conflict, and the numbers are worth putting in context, rather than taking at face value from either side. CENTCOM's commander, Admiral Brad Cooper, told the Senate Armed Services Committee in mid-May that CENTCOM and its regional partners intercepted more than 6,000 one-way attack drones and over 1,500 ballistic missiles aimed at you. Hess forces, Israel, and Arab partner nations over the course of the conflict. More recently, in early July, Cooper specifically recognized American soldiers and sailors assigned to a joint counter-unmanned aerial systems unit in Bahrain for shooting down 14 Iranian one-way attack drones over the preceding several weeks. This came the same week Cooper met with Bahrain's King Hamad to discuss continued defense cooperation, following a regional security dialogue in Manama that brought together military officials from a dozen countries focused on protecting shipping through Hormuz. It's worth noting that Iran and the U.S. have offered sharply different damage assessments throughout this conflict, which is normal in wartime reporting and shouldn't be taken uncritically from either side. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps has at various points claimed to have struck U.S. military installations and inflicted meaningful damage, while CENTCOM statements have generally said incoming missiles and drones were intercepted with no American personnel harmed. Independent reporting, including from Wikipedia's compiled timeline of strikes on Bahrain and other open-source tracking, shows a more mixed picture. There have been real strikes that got through air defenses at various points earlier in the conflict, including drone and missile impacts in Manama that caused civilian casualties, damaged a refinery, and hit infrastructure, including a data center, alongside the much larger number of intercepted attacks CENTCOM has publicized. So while it's fair to describe American and Allied air defense performance as historically extensive, and CENTCOM's own numbers back that up, it would be inaccurate to say Iranian strikes uniformly failed to cause any damage over the full length of the conflict. The most recent skirmishes, including the 14 drones intercepted in Bahrain in late June and early July, appear to have been fully intercepted. But that's a snapshot from recent weeks, not a claim that covers the entire war. On the technology side, there has been public discussion, some of it speculative, about what specific systems the U.S. military has been using to counter Iranian drone swarms so effectively in recent months. High-powered microwave weapons and directed energy systems have been discussed publicly by defense officials and analysts as tools being fielded in the CENTCOM area of operations, designed to disable multiple drones at once by frying their electronics rather than shooting them down individually. These systems are attractive because of the cost imbalance involved. A single Iranian one-way attack drone, commonly a variant of the Shahed design, can cost on the order of tens of thousands of dollars to produce, while intercepting it with a traditional missile interceptor can cost far more per shot. Directed energy and high-powered microwave systems, by contrast, have a functionally unlimited magazine and a marginal cost per engagement that's a small fraction of a traditional interceptor. It's worth being clear that the specific unit type, capability details, and deployment timeline of these systems are not something CENTCOM has laid out in full public detail, so treat the more granular claims about exactly which systems are doing the work as informed speculation rather than confirmed fact, even though the broader shift toward directed energy and electronic countermeasures in the region is well documented. Now, let's move to a story that has largely stayed under the radar while all of the Iran coverage has dominated headlines, and that's what's happening across the Taiwan Strait. China's newest and most advanced aircraft carrier, the Fujian, made another transit through the Taiwan Strait in late June, this time a day after Taiwan launched its annual Hankuang combat readiness exercises. This wasn't the Fujian's first pass through the strait. It made an earlier transit back in December of last year, shortly after its commissioning ceremony in Hainan, which President Xi Jinping personally attended. The first transit was widely assessed by Taiwanese and Western defense analysts as a return trip to a shipyard near Shanghai for maintenance rather than a deliberate show of force, since the carrier's flight deck was empty of aircraft both times. Chinese state media has generally downplayed these transits as routine parts of the carrier's ongoing sea trials and training cycle, and Taiwan's defense ministry has said its assessment is that the transits carry no explicit military intent, even as it continues to monitor them closely with its own aircraft and radar assets. Still, the optics and timing, a Chinese carrier passing through the strait the day after Taiwan's own major readiness drill, are the kind of signal that regional militaries and intelligence services take seriously regardless of the stated purpose. Because in this environment, timing itself communicates something. What makes this moment more complicated and genuinely interesting from an analytical standpoint is what's happening simultaneously inside the Chinese military's own command structure. Over the past several months, Xi Jinping has removed a striking number of senior military officials from positions of authority. This started with the ouster of Central Military Commission Vice Chairman Zhang Yuxia and Joint Staff Department Chief Liu Zhenli back in January. Then, in late June, China removed 6 more senior military figures from their seats in the National People's Congress, including the head of the Central Military Commission's Equipment Development Department. Analysis from the East Asia Forum characterizes the cumulative effect as leaving the Central Military Commission running with only 2 active members, Xi himself and Vice Chairman Zhang Shengmin, compared to a normal complement of 7, and notes that this leaves no operational track general at the center of China's military command structure. This is a genuinely striking internal contradiction worth sitting with for a moment. China is simultaneously projecting outward military strength toward Taiwan through carrier deployments, Coast Guard activity, questioning commercial vessels near Taiwan, and large-scale exercises, while its own senior command structure is being hollowed out through repeated rounds of anti-corruption and loyalty purges. Analysts differ on what this means for near-term risk. Some read the purges as evidence that Xi is consolidating control precisely because he anticipates needing absolute loyalty for a future contingency involving Taiwan. Others, including the East Asia Forum analysis, argue the opposite, that gutting the operational command structure actually makes Beijing less capable of executing a complex joint invasion in the near term, and that the more likely posture for the coming period is sustained pressure and coercion, things like Coast Guard harassment of shipping and continued military drills, rather than an imminent invasion attempt. It's also worth noting that China's own military modernization, particularly its investment in systems designed to keep American forces at a distance from Taiwan, means that even a degraded command structure at the top doesn't necessarily translate into reduced overall capability in a crisis, since much of that capability is now embedded in systems and doctrine rather than dependent on any single general. There's also a broader regional dynamic tying the Iran situation and the Taiwan situation together, which is worth naming explicitly rather than treating as 2 unrelated stories. American munitions stockpiles, particularly for certain categories of interceptors and precision weapons, have reportedly been drawn down significantly by the intensity of the campaign against Iran, with some estimates suggesting more than half of pre-war inventories of some key munitions types have been expended, and rebuilding that stockpile is expected to take somewhere between 1 and 4 years, depending on the category of weapon. That matters for Taiwan, because any future crisis in the Indo-Pacific would draw on some of the same categories of American air defense and precision strike inventory that have just been heavily used in the Middle East. Whether that reality actually changes Beijing's calculus on timing is genuinely disputed among analysts, But it is at minimum a factor being discussed seriously inside American defense planning circles. It's a good example of why events in the Persian Gulf and events near Taiwan, despite being geographically and politically distinct, are not fully separable from each other in terms of overall American military posture and readiness. So where does all of this leave us? The ceasefire between Iran, Israel, and the United States is holding in the sense that there hasn't been a return to full-scale war, but it's holding under real strain. The core disagreement over nuclear inspections, specifically whether the sites that were bombed will ever be open to international inspectors, is unresolved, and both sides have strong, legitimate-sounding reasons for their position when you actually listen to how each side frames it. Washington and the IAEA both say verification of the bombed sites is essential to confirming Iran's nuclear program has actually been set back in a durable way. Iran says opening those sites now, before a permanent settlement locks in sanctions relief and the return of frozen assets, would mean giving up its remaining leverage and potentially exposing sensitive military information for nothing in return. Neither position is unreasonable on its own terms, even though they are currently incompatible with each other, and that incompatibility is exactly why outside observers are watching this dispute so closely. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz remains a live pressure point, with Iran asserting greater control over the waterway, and the United States rejecting any Iranian authority to tax or restrict international shipping there, even as actual tanker traffic has continued largely uninterrupted in recent weeks. CENTCOM continues to report a strong record of intercepting Iranian drones and missiles aimed at regional targets, a record that is real and well documented, even if it shouldn't be read as suggesting no Iranian strikes have ever gotten through over the full course of this conflict, because some clearly have, with real civilian and infrastructure damage in places like Bahrain earlier in the war. And on the other side of the world, Taiwan continues to watch Chinese carrier transits and Coast Guard activity with real concern, even as Beijing's own internal military purges introduced genuine uncertainty about how quickly China could actually execute a major operation against Taiwan if it chose to. The honest answer, and I think it's important to say this plainly rather than pretend to more certainty than actually exists, is that serious, well-informed people disagree about whether these purges make near-term conflict over Taiwan more or less likely, and anyone claiming total confidence in either direction is overselling what's actually known. What ties all of this together is a simple, less dramatic point than the headlines usually convey. Negotiations involving Iran and posturing involving China and Taiwan are proceeding through public statements from multiple governments that often directly contradict each other, sometimes issued on the very same day about the very same agreement. That's not necessarily evidence of deliberate deception by any one party, although it certainly can look that way from the outside. It's also just a normal feature of high-stakes diplomacy conducted partly in public, where each government has an incentive to describe an ambiguous or still-forming agreement in the terms most favorable to itself, for its own domestic audience, as much as for the other side. The task for anyone trying to actually understand what's happening is to notice where the different accounts agree, which is usually the more reliable signal, and to treat the points of sharp disagreement, like exactly what was promised on nuclear inspections, as genuinely unresolved rather than assuming any single government's public statement is the full and final truth. Before I close this out, let me back up and fill in some of the context that explains how we actually got to this point, because the inspections fight doesn't make full sense without it. The current framework everyone is arguing over traces back to something called the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, signed by President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, which launched a 60-day negotiating window meant to turn a fragile ceasefire into something closer to a permanent settlement, with Pakistan acting as the lead mediator alongside other regional partners. Ghalibaf has described that memorandum in triumphant terms domestically, telling Iranian audiences that it was not the product of American pressure and coercion, but rather, in his words, a declaration of America's defeat, achieved through what he called the resistance and authority of the Iranian nation. That kind of framing matters because it tells you Ghalibaf is speaking to two audiences at once every time he makes a public statement: the international negotiating table and a domestic Iranian public that has been told for months that the war ended in a form of Iranian victory rather than a costly, damaging setback. Any inspection regime that looks like Iran caving to American demands would directly undercut that domestic narrative, which is one more reason Tehran has strong incentives to draw hard lines specifically on the bombed military sites, even while allowing more routine access elsewhere. It's also worth remembering what the two sides were actually proposing before this narrower inspections dispute became the headline issue. Earlier in the year, the American proposal on the table reportedly called for a full end to Iran's nuclear enrichment program, limits on Iran's missile arsenal, a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz to normal commercial terms, restrictions on Iran's support for allied armed groups across the region, and sanctions relief in exchange. Iran's counterproposal, by contrast, centered on an end to American and Israeli strikes on Iranian and allied forces in Lebanon and Iraq, security guarantees against future attacks, war reparations, and international recognition of Iranian authority over the Strait of Hormuz specifically, those two starting positions were far apart, and the U.S. rejected Iran's counterproposal just as Iran rejected the initial American one. Talks broke down at least once in April, with Vance leaving without an agreement and Trump announcing a naval blockade of Iranian ports before negotiations resumed later that month in Islamabad. By late May, Trump was saying both sides were close to a deal involving what he called strong inspections, while Iran's chief negotiator at the time said he wasn't sure a deal was actually imminent, and an advisor to Iran's supreme leader dismissed the idea of American control over Iran's nuclear program as what he called a fantasy. So the current disagreement over inspection access isn't a new development. It's the latest version of a disagreement that has run through nearly every stage of this negotiation for months, just now focused specifically on the question of the bombed sites rather than the broader shape of a deal. One additional piece of context that's easy to miss if you're only following the nuclear story: this negotiation has never existed in isolation from the wider regional picture, particularly the situation in Lebanon. Iran and Lebanon's government have both pushed for weeks for Israeli forces to withdraw from Lebanese territory, but the actual memorandum of understanding signed by the U.S. and Iran only addresses an end to hostilities between those two countries directly, without resolving the question of Israel's continued presence in southern Lebanon. Israel's defense minister has said there has been no American demand for Israel to withdraw, even as fighting between Israeli forces and Iran-backed Hezbollah has continued at a lower intensity, including a reported Israeli soldier killed in southern Lebanon, even after the broader ceasefire took hold. Lebanon's president, Joseph Aoun, has publicly defended his government's own separate negotiations with Israel, rejecting the idea that those talks amount to surrendering Lebanese sovereignty and insisting that the emerging framework is meant to protect rather than weaken Lebanon's position. This matters here because it shows the ceasefire isn't really one clean agreement covering the whole region. It's a patchwork of separate, overlapping negotiating tracks: U.S., Iran, Israel, Hezbollah, Israel, Lebanon, all proceeding on their own timelines, which makes the overall situation more fragile than a single headline about a ceasefire holding might suggest, since a breakdown on any one track has the potential to spill over into the others. Domestically, inside the United States, this conflict has also produced real political friction that's worth noting briefly, because it shapes how much flexibility the American side has going forward. The Senate narrowly approved a House-passed war powers resolution, seen as a symbolic rebuke of the president's authority to continue military action against Iran without further congressional approval, though a separate measure aimed at more directly restricting that authority was rejected by the Senate shortly after. Polling on the war itself has been mixed, and in places unfavorable to the administration's handling of it. An Associated Press poll found roughly 2/3 of Americans disapproved of how the president handled the conflict with Iran, and a separate poll found a similar share of Americans said they were not confident in the emerging nuclear deal with Iran. At the same time, other polling found a majority of Republicans viewing the broader deal favorably, and even a majority of likely voters overall expressing support for reaching an agreement with Iran rather than continuing military action. Public opinion on this, in other words, is genuinely split and depends heavily on which specific question you ask, which is a useful reminder not to treat any single poll as the final word on how the country feels about where this is headed. There's also been a significant somber development inside Iran itself that adds another layer of uncertainty to the political picture there: the death of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Iranian officials have said they deliberately excluded certain countries from the funeral invitation list, accusing those nations of taking what Iranian officials described as an inappropriate position in support of the American and Israeli military campaign against Iran. A leadership transition of this magnitude, happening in the middle of an already tense negotiation over the country's nuclear future, adds a layer of internal political uncertainty on the Iranian side that's easy to overlook if you're only following the inspection story, but it's a real factor. Succession politics inside Iran's system, where the selection of a new supreme leader involves a specific constitutional process run by the Assembly of Experts, could easily influence how much room Iran's current negotiating team actually has to make concessions, regardless of what they might privately be willing to agree to. It's also worth spending a moment on why this particular dispute ripples so far beyond the two countries directly involved. The Strait of Hormuz carries a substantial share of the world's seaborne oil and liquefied natural gas exports, which means every one of Iran's tanker warnings, every CENTCOM statement about intercepted drones near the strait, and every ambiguous comment from Ghalibaf about controlling the waterway gets watched closely by energy markets, shipping insurers, and the Gulf states that depend on that traffic for their own economies. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain have all had to balance their own security cooperation with the United States against their economic and, in some cases, direct territorial exposure to any renewed fighting, which is part of why last week's regional security dialogue in Manama brought together military officials from a dozen countries specifically to coordinate on protecting shipping through Hormuz, rather than leaving that entirely to American forces. None of those Gulf governments want to see this ceasefire collapse, and that shared interest gives them a quiet but real stake in how the inspections dispute gets resolved, even though they aren't direct parties to the US-Iran negotiation itself. Pulling all of these threads together, I think the honest framing is this. What looks, in any single day's headline, like a clean story of Iran defying an agreement, or America declaring victory, or China menacing Taiwan, is really several loosely connected, still unresolved processes running in parallel, each with real uncertainty baked in, and each shaped as much by internal politics on every side, American domestic politics, Iranian succession politics, and Chinese Communist Party command politics, as by the external diplomacy that actually makes the news. That's not a satisfying, clean narrative, but it's a more accurate one, and it's worth keeping in mind before drawing hard conclusions from any single day's statement out of Tehran, Washington, or Beijing. On the Taiwan side, it's worth adding one more layer of nuance before wrapping up, because the story of Chinese carrier transits can sound more alarming in isolation than it looks once you place it alongside the historical pattern. This was not an unusual or unprecedented event on its own. The Fujian's December transit, the Liaoning's transit in April, and this most recent late June passage all follow a now fairly established rhythm of Chinese carriers, periodically moving between home ports and shipyards through the strait, generally without embarked aircraft, and generally assessed by Taiwan's own defense ministry as carrying no explicit military intent on a case-by-case basis. Comparisons to Japanese and American vessels making similar transits through the same waterway are also worth keeping in mind, since Washington and its allies argue the strait is international water open to all nations, a position China disputes. And both sides continue to exercise that disagreement in practice through routine transits rather than confrontation. What makes analysts pay a closer attention this time isn't the transit itself so much as its timing next to Taiwan's own exercise and the backdrop of China's internal purges, both of which add interpretive weight to an act that, mechanically, isn't new. That's a good general lesson for reading this kind of news. The raw fact of a carrier transit or a troop movement often matters less than the political context surrounding it. And getting that context right is usually more valuable than the raw fact by itself. That's where things stand as of today. I'll keep tracking the inspections dispute, the situation in the Strait, the Lebanon track, and what comes out of the next round of technical talks, along with anything new on the Taiwan side, and bring you updates as the picture develops. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.